Hello everyone, today we talk about naval artillery in the late Middle Ages. I think it's not the first time we actually talk about this, but this is more sort of introductive to the sort of the broader picture and or at least to major theaters of European warfare, the 100 Years' War, the Mediterranean. This topic is interesting for a multitude of reasons. First of all, it's obviously framed in the general steps that naval development took during the later Middle Ages, just like the same artillery through the introduction of firearms. Today we essentially talk just about gunpowder naval artillery. You know, that I made a video recently about the etymology of artillery that in fact was around before firearms were. There's also a question regarding which were the first firearms actually used ever, and there is a very interesting story behind that we still haven't covered adequately. We haven't made so many sort of East and West military comparisons. At large, we talk about Chinese warfare, and as you know, what we conventionally intend as gunpowder was apparently first handled in China. But the picture is much more complex, not just for the fact that Europeans ended up to make a much more explosive use of gunpowder, naturally, obviously, through the different proportions in the mixtures, mostly the greater amount of saltpeter as opposed to sulfur. That is also a big question, like why did the Chinese use mostly the incendiary effect other than, because of course the notion also that the Chinese used that only for fireworks is also, that doesn't make sense. But indeed the Europeans developed this stuff in a apparently more sophisticated fashion since the very beginning. But we don't know what that beginning actually occurred, so it's possible that firearms were there already. We know they were there by the 13th century. We don't know exactly when and how the actual mixture was systemically applied to weapons, to warfare. And that's mostly the most interesting part of the story. But one thing is certain, that is, and people tend sometimes to get this wrong, that is, as soon as firearms were around, basically, even in the most primitive fashion, basically any kind of feature of firearms, by the way you see them develop in medieval times, including explosive shells, for example, were around, right? It was never a lagging period where we see, bombards developing, for example. The technology appeared and it was just relegated to stone shooting or just, to terrestrial warfare. Everything was immediately there. And it seems, especially, and this is not really a surprise, that in fact the most straightforwardly advanced and updated naval powers in this sense were using properly firearms at their most, and immediately right off the bat were in fact Venice, the Mamluks. And as we all understand here now, we shouldn't even make the mistake of presuming that these were the powers that necessarily arrived first to it, nor that it makes any sense to presume to pinpoint a specific power to use it first. I mean, surely it would have happened in a more or less formal sense, even though, of course, medieval powers were at times very, very private, not necessarily identifiable with a given public authority, depending on how you see it, as within mostly like feudal hierarchies, even with universal empires. It's not important because, as we've seen in other videos about late medieval artillery, there isn't such a thing like a place where gunpowder firearms were not used right off the bat from a chronological point of view. Even the least developed, the more primitive areas, like, every Scottish lord in one of their sort of unstable castles in the Celtic fringe actually had, doesn't matter how simple, how cheap in some ways, their own bombard, right? And they were quite jealous of that. We've seen this especially in medieval Scottish army organization. This is also something that you can measure in the sense of the later development of the systems that, as you know, through the mid-14th century crisis tend to become much more regionally statalized. Even at the provincial level, you realize that there is basically an elite that tends to professionalize warfare by having essentially the exhausted population, exhausted by the plague, by war, and mostly from the previous generations, starting to basically delegate warfare to just the top, the elite, smaller armies, but more professional in nature, and within this sense, sort of a greater technological investment of some sort. So at that point, say, if we talk Scotland, it's also easy to document a reality like that, because you realize that there is a kingdom that field armies that are, doesn't matter how these are a product of civil wars, legitimacy aside, have a pretty sizable amount of firepower, right, of firearms available. And so there is basically no other place in Europe that does not account in that way. And in the same way, we have seen how, of course, there are differences by, if not by scale, at least it depends what we're looking at. For example, we covered very much Hussite warfare to the extent of explaining why, for example, the type of artillery that the Hussites employed surely was very well employed, but also was of some of the poorer kind, right? You could find among the Bohemian peasantry by maybe just looting a castle arsenal in Central Europe and putting that together for the general purpose and in the general context that rebellion entailed. But say if, I don't know, the Bohemian Wagenburgs had taken the battlefields of France or Italy, just the firepower alone employed by those countries in the same years would have annihilated that Hussite tactical model, so to say. We also observed some of this early artillery use, and well, at least of some aspect. For example, the first mobile sort of field gun of some sort, properly conceived for being moved across the field. We've seen it in some 15th century battle here and there. Recently, we talked, for example, the Battle of Molinella about this, also the one of Caravaggio. We recently made a video about the sort of Eastern style of guns, so to say. We're often connected with a sort of monster size. We've seen, for example, the Ottoman, the Mamluk cannons. We've seen the Ruthenian slave cannon. It's very interesting. So, aside from these, exceptional, exceptions, as a matter of fact, we're looking at a European and also Eurasian panorama where artillery does develop, yes, in different ways, mostly speaking of single policy availability, but not much just like a substantially in a substantially different technical sense, right? Yes, again, Europeans seem to have, thanks to their third estates, were quite developed and having this sort of unique framework of sort of different countries competing with one another, but still within a sort of universal European realm, domain, developing very sophisticated types of artillery, apparently higher in quality to, in fact, what most of their enemies could field, right? Even when, there is a great debate, for example, who did invent at the end of this period the granulation of gunpowder, which brought to a much swifter, rapid ignition, an explosion as such. And the Ottomans are often credited for having sort of invented this, but it seems that they, if anything, had invested very much in artillery, and they made greater use of the technique per se to be better documented, to be sort of more out there. But it's not necessarily like the Ottomans had in absolute terms like a better artillery than Europeans, and vice versa, meaning that in general, technically wise, in terms of availability, in terms of variety, in terms of also probably quantity fielded, in proportion, Europeans were top in this. I.e., again, we find the bigger the monster, bomber would say, oh, look, the Indians and Mughals used that. Look at it. Even China had maybe early forms of pike and shot warfare of some kind, even though we should clarify what that is, and this is definitely not the video for doing that. But at the end of the day, by the aforementioned parameters, the Westerners really went beyond in ways that other countries fundamentally wouldn't, including at the beginning of the 16th century, given that we're talking naval artillery, starting to design ships that were properly engineered on the basis of properly military development and artillery integration, as opposed to what had happened during the Middle Ages, that yes, certain models had been of ships refined towards and characterized towards the preferably military function, but that also, and still at the end of this period, in fact, even by being civilian cargoes and typologies armed, would have gone well in different ways. That's really there is an acceleration, as we know, in technological development towards the later Middle Ages that should always be understood more like in that political and social key rather than for any specific technological reason. That is mostly like a consequence of something rather than a cause, and that in fact is also more complex but also more correct to investigate as such. Naturally, naval artillery, again, was there. We know of explosive shells, we know of torpedoes, even again, the Egyptians had that, the Italians had that, and in particular, in fact, in this difference, the Egyptians, we also made a video about Mamluk artillery in general. It wasn't properly dedicated to naval artillery, but we've seen that they had a lot of things going on by experimenting, but again, they didn't have really the estates that at this point Genoa or Venice, that in fact we will discuss in the end, would have in order to regularly fit their ships with that type of artillery, just having the ships that they had. So the things went in parallel in that direction. In fact, it's not until really the Ottomans that Europeans meet anyone who has some sort of greater artillery capacity than theirs at some point. Now, these are all side considerations, but they must be understood before venturing into the broader picture. Then there is, of course, during the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, so we skip everything happening before, and again, how firearms had come into being, what scientists were doing at the time, how they came to learn evenly much before the actual formulas. By the way, this is something I discussed also in the recent video about the Byzantine so-called liquid fire, which actually heads to a knowledge of explosives slightly much older than we tend to think, but that didn't seem particularly fitting and or at least fully understood or thought to be particularly convenient, also for properly the means of employment, given properly the sustainability of the armies of the time. We skip all of that. We get straight to the 100 Years' War, because we happen to be fairly well, there are, again, if we were to document the spread of artillery across Europe, we would go relatively easy for most countries here. But obviously France and England are quite advanced feudal monarchies. They are at war with one another, as you know, for quite a long time. They really used a great amount of resources. They were financed by even, again, some of the countries that we were mentioning before, like the one from which the great Italian banks came from. This is something that we discussed recently also, as far as where, for example, the English longbows were produced. That many of them were imported to England from Lombardy, for that matter. And it's interesting. Of course, you cannot separate these areas of Europe, because Western Europe basically functioned a bit in the same way. We have seen in the video about, I remember whether specifically Lithuanian artillery, or at least we're talking about the Lithuanian army. We talked about the appearance of artillery, and obviously the more north and the more east you go in Europe, the later you find evidence for guns that, again, must not be confused with the overlapping, let's say, the actual appearance in that time, in which the guns are documented of the same technology per se that already existed from generations. Just those are countries that produce less sources and therefore make us see less of what is there. And in parallel, the fact that they produce less sources is also like a sort of civilizational thing as well. And of course, they would have had these guns sort of immediately available in smaller quantities. And so being, especially as far as artillery is concerned, less relevant. I mean, in a less than proportional sense to that kind of documentation. We see, in fact, that Lithuania actually made even an early use, as far as we understand, a consistent one of guns, but at the same time, their artillery parks were relatively reduced. If you look at, I don't know, England or France. England and France that seem, in fact, equally to have employed guns from the onset of the 100 Years' War, right? This is easily demonstrable. And it's also obvious because, again, these guns would have been conceived, again, not like you would see in Renaissance engineering, okay, let's start building ships properly conceived, designed for lodging artillery of some kind. Artillery, as we've seen, was always mounted on ships. There were trebuchets, there were catapult, whatever, all this stuff. So the firearms come around and you basically start using them in the same way. Also because, again, what's the difference between a crossbow and a ballista at the end of the day in between? It's just a matter of size. Also in here, you would have small handguns, something really ridiculously looking, considering the further development of firearms, but still there, and at some point in a bigger, or at the same time actually, and surely at the same time, because we even have the explicit documentation for this demonstrating it, bombards, right, employed in ways that, in this sense, we understand a bit less, because we have iconographic sources confirming that, we have documentary sources confirming that, even detailing the size of these guns, the quantities, etc. But how they were actually employed, that is always like a bit like the big question mark. We would sort of get it and understand it, but it's the thing that we can't properly photograph in the moment. We can't sort of plausibly guess it, but not really seen it. Because the doctrine of employment is really something else. And especially in the Middle Ages, there wasn't such like a concept like doctrine, military theory. And if anything, again, these technologies were also so simple, rudimentary, that they could have easily been employed a bit like by anyone that was basically trained with them. It's just like, I don't know, had you given this to the Romans, they would have immediately started using them without problems, right? That the world myth that we developed as modernists, if these guys had had things of their own, they would have not really understood that because the mentality is so different. Give a legionnaire an MG42 and he ironically will conquer Germania without much problem. Like there isn't really a limit to that. It's pretty silly to presume it. In any case, we see, for example, a Norman fleet assembling in as early as 1338 some guns, including at least one pot de fer that was a rudimentary cannon that propelled heavy iron bolts known as quarrels. Not only, by the way, marking a nascent but purposeful adoption of gunpowder technology in maritime warfare. Right, likely driven by the concurrent refinement, of course, of land-based artillery that harnessed the explosive force of black powder to that devastating effect. In fact, as you know, one of about Roger de Millimet, if I'm not wrong, he is one of this manuscript we find the first depiction of this pot de fer that is used like in this unlikely way, just literally a pot. Because initially just pot makers were the only ones who had the technology to properly make that sort of circular section in a symmetrical fashion with an actual dart. So not even, I don't know, some mitraille, stuff into... It would have been used as well, but not a bowl, right? Not yet, or at least they were there, but not in that case. And pointed, like literally on a table, pointed to a castle gate. and operated by a guy that is like a typical knight of the era. And so it makes all sense that we would know for an early, say, stage of the 100 Years' War, when this is documented, also having fleets equipped with this kind of guns. Naturally, again, the artistic license of iconographic sources is something. It's generally accurate, and it sort of makes sense with the wall. But at the same time, we have always this understanding in medieval technology. This is true also for the ancient one. For everything that we can fairly document from an iconographic, archaeological, documentary point of view, there would have been so many different things that would have not looked really that different, but it's like, I don't know, siege engines. We get the best documentation for the single big monster pieces, massive trebuchet, etc. That we know that we were many smaller trebuchet, catapults, ballistas, whatever. But these, the soldiers didn't really care about. There were many, and they always traveled with the army, by the way. And everybody knew what they were at the time. They didn't seem like this big deal. And so the average term is, I don't know, machina or tormenta or whatever. And sometimes they are properly mixed, like there isn't like a linear categorical distinction between the various types. The most important thing is that it was what was needed to wage war in a siege in that specific case. Naturally, when we look at early naval artillery, we realize that its employment was mostly anti-ship and also anti-fortifications. So yes, naval bombardment were actually pretty common, as they had been before, even with trebuchet, etc. Of course, the anti-naval function is true, right? In the same way, except, of course, this particular technology starts operating in sort of different ways, right? This is not much like a counterweight, a torsion engine. This is really something that, on the long run, is immediately heading towards a much greater joule employment, so that when properly channeled in a barrel, can shoot projectiles at unprecedented speed and power. So even if, of course, the two types of artillery, say the traditional one and the gunpowder one, coexist for a long time, up to the Renaissance, basically, and in certain cases even beyond, but just for a few generations, you can argue that, yes, artillery was kind of understood to have a very big potential for all kind of experimentation, application, because the concept is immediate. Like, the point is, how do you develop? For example, we've made different videos about different types of late medieval guns and how they developed, how they started being properly, also quantitatively available, as we were hinting at before. And that was a huge challenge that had only a few to do with sort of the technological invention, or even just innovation. It was mostly about how do you even finance that, and who's going to pay for that, or was going to take care of it, was going to organize it, was going to have the competence for it. So again, people saw in the future much more quickly what could happen, and they could effectively implement that. In fact, also, all those ideas that, oh my god, the first times that the guns were used in the battlefield, everybody was scared. Probably somebody was scared as they could be scared of thunder, etc. But again, it doesn't even seem that this was a relevant military historical quantity of some sort, like in the broader psychology of warfare and development of the art of war. A long-standing but now discredited theory, just to stick to the beginning of the 100 Years' War, suggested that English ships at that point were equipped with breech-loading brass and iron reboot gun. More or less in the same year, we were looking at the Norman example of the Pot de Fer. So essentially, this would have been multi-barreled weapons engineered for rapid, concentrated volleys to decimate enemy crews. But this was more like historical fantasies being totally disproven. it's not like in the future there wouldn't be similar weapons, but through exhaustive examination of primary sources, there's no evidence of this kind of guns being there. Mostly, they were just very simple tubes, like, I don't know, a bombard, imagine that. We will come back to it, because we know, of course, from some of the best documented parts of Europe that these things were already around, and we can't simply assess that everybody had it already. What is fascinating often is that minor centers could specialize rather than the bigger ones in guns production at some point, especially at the beginning, especially as they were a novelty. There are interesting parallels also as far as who would actually go at war and with which resources. Would it use mercenaries first or not? So even as far as technology is concerned, don't think that necessarily the most advanced place is the one that is simply invested in creating more of this, and especially with these emerging technologies, the bigger system, even just from an economical point of view, is saying, okay, well, if new stuff comes around, we will be the first ones being to be able to purchase that, because at least we're the richest. And then if it works, we will be investing on how to produce this stuff in a more systematic way. Again, for the English and the French to have had these guns by readily available and employed on ships on land, but at the beginning of the 100 Years' War, we can't think that this stuff was already being toyed with from a century, right? And that, of course, already from a generation or so, these guns had been used for some kind of military purpose, and say, I don't know, sovereigns being exposed to novelties, whatever, were shown, and they were aware of that, but they wouldn't still yet see like a practical application. They weren't also the minds thinking about, in fact, much bigger issues that would have taken specifically that into consideration. It was a pretty, likely a very spontaneous proliferation of these guns for anybody who would have liked to use it in a more military function. It was not necessarily the idea of the local baron that paid money for that. It's just somebody proposed it to them and they started financing them on the way, right? That's mostly how it went. By the Battle of Sluis in 1340, as you know, this was a major naval battle during the 100 Years' War. Both French and English fleets were unequivocally deploying guns, right? So it's so much out there. Obviously, the English and the French do not have any sensible material difference, culturally wise, employ what the other employs, right? And so they're deploying these guns with documentary evidence confirming that at least one English vessel was destroyed by cannon fire in some way. So we can presume mostly, I don't know, maybe literally its hull had been pierced, had been broken through, signaling a strategic reorientation towards leveraging artillery to disrupt enemy formations, sow chaos, and undermine morale in naval encounters. A tactic that capitalized on the shock value of early firearms, but that was already mixed in parallel with, in fact, the traditional type of artillery that already could produce similar damage, by the way. Initially, ships carried a sparse complement of guns. The largest French vessels at Sluis were outfitted, we can't think, with only one, 4 guns each, we can't imagine. Because these were fairly small, and they were just mostly like supporting weapons. As you know, most of the tactics, naval warfare at the time, revolved around boarding. This had been the case since antiquity. Yes, there were long phases of skirmishing, whatever, stuff like that, depending on the situation, but big naval engagements were just like land engagements. You basically form battle lines, and you interlocked with one another, and you destroy each other. Everything actually at sea was it was more physical than on land, paradoxically, because at least on land you had these cavalry charges, and if you broke through, it was done. Like with with ships, you can't do that, right? Actually, you have to be careful, even if you set them on fire, that you don't catch fire yourself. There isn't much room for maneuvering. And yes, it's not like a rigid chain. So some ships were chained actually with one another. But in fact, it's a much more sort of close range and unwieldy thing. And so boarding is the best thing. So you can easily imagine that using, as it would fully develop in the Renaissance with brutal effectiveness, that the need of sweeping the enemy ship's decks was quite fitting for artillery, especially with mitraille. But again, at close range, having these single shots, that because it took forever to reload against an armored opponent, right? Like the ones that were squeezed, like the Marines, the men-at-arms on this ship decks at relatively close range, even with the poor accuracy that these early guns had, was something, right? And it could be used just like, I don't know, a stone thrower could break this guy's necks and spine. So it's more or less the same kind of reasoning, just in a direction that obviously starts becoming ever more precise and ever more especially anti-armored, mostly anti-structure, because frankly, rather than anti-personnel, these guns were anti-structure, right? This is very much true. But if you realize that only 6 years later, the Battle of Crécy would actually witness the use of bombards from the English side against the French army, you realize how things work. There is this a bit, also in an anti-personnel fashion, there is this sort of myth among the many ones that circulate about medieval armies that essentially medieval artillery would have been used, and we're talking also more traditional artillery, counterweight, torsion, etc., would have been used preferably just against castles. Artillery is just for sieges, right? This is actually not correct. First of all, for a reason that is operational. Yes, artillery was mostly used and designed and operated against fortifications, but armies actually brought artillery with them, right? And not all of it, not all the one that, say, when encamping in front of a siege, would have also been started to be built around, brought from other places or whatever. But still, right? And so the fact that bombards were, say, at Crécy is not much a matter of, okay, yes, we can use them against the French, but they would have been normal at that point if bombards were around in general, because, hey, it's, campaigns do revolve around sieges, just like, I don't know, the modern ones or the ancient ones, right? So actually this notion that the Middle Ages was just sieges and rare pitched battles, it's BS, right? There was the greater activity in combat involved was definitely in open field, right? Because people forget in between the pitched battles that weren't actually rare at all. All the smaller pitched battles all around, right, that do not go down sort of military history books, or at least they're not highlighted in particular, but that for anyone who has studied medieval chronicles and more, like, are literally all over the place and basically constitute the constant military activity of all these fighters, including, again, going for sieges and encountering themselves in the midst of somewhere, but still, again, so never make that mistake of presuming otherwise. Well, artillery would have been there. The same goes for naval guns, naval artillery. Again, they would have had artillery already, and now the firearm technology was just assigning this other artillery. Gunpowder, the gunpowder one was there, unavoidably. As we were saying, there is more like a non-military factor bringing to why, like, guns, firearms were like in such small numbers at the beginning, as opposed to traditional artillery, right? If you think about, I don't know, 4 guns of sort on the French vessels as Louis on average, as we can speculate, you would imagine, of course, everything being rooted to how much they cost. How it wasn't even about the guns per se, but notoriously the powder, not even the ammo, right? That was fairly cheap, at least to procure, at least compared to the actual gunpowder. as such. Besides, these guns were already sort of relatively demanding to use, even just to operate, to be somehow specialized in them. As we've seen, they demanded lengthy reloading cycles. They required specialized crews proficient in the intricate mechanism of this early priming and firing technology. So everything adds up, right? And it's just how you have technology today. Like, it seems like, okay, yeah, there are lots of people working behind that, but it's kind of normal that there is, because guess what? There are lots of people working at everything in some ways, and so you don't even notice. But of course, gradually, that's how, I don't know, you remember your early phones, if you're old enough. Well, that's, cell phones, of course. I'm not that old, of course. You may never know. Well, that's how they came around in some ways. This gunpowder technology is much more primitive, also in as much as it's also more straightforward to conceive and understand. There would have been less variation. Already cell phones are something incredibly more complicated than it. But this, if anything, gives you an idea also of how longer it would take for this stuff to simply develop further, right? Cell phones are, again, literally have boomed in a matter of a few decades. This stuff was probably around, as we've seen, for longer than we imagine. At least all the ingredients were there. Also, the early weapons were probably earlier than we can document. Well, surely they were older than we can document. But again, we see gradually just appearing these guns and remaining for a long time pretty much the same thing, right? Within a few decades, however, the scale of shipboard armaments expanded dramatically. For the time being, like a warship commissioned in 1377 under Jean de Vienn's direction was armed with up to 34 guns, which is really a lot by the third quarter of the 14th century, reflecting a deliberate strategic commitment to naval firepower at this point, and the development of shipbuilding techniques as well, right? Because in order to sustain 34 guns, your ship is going to be slightly bulkier and more resistant. It must have some sort of, again, ships were not really designed to incorporate artillery per se, because artillery was just simply mounted on the decks, on the on the sides and so on, in ways that were quite ad hoc and could be easily put up in the moment and also sported. Because you could imagine, just yesterday we were looking at the Crimean War and how the Tsarists basically sunk their own ships in order to block the harbor of Sevastopol before having, of course, extracted their guns that they used naval guns used to defend the city from land. So just imagine how interchangeable these guns could be also for land operations. I mean, the ships needed to remain armed to a degree, and so that would have been the thing as well. But say if you wanted to use them to support like a land force, you could easily carry these guns with you. However, already at this point, you could easily understand how reinforced hulls and deck frameworks would be structured to mitigate the stresses of heavy ordnance recoil, thereby enhancing the vessel's combat durability. This was not really conscious, meaning that, yes, in this instance you find definitely, even at the time, an unusual concentration of guns, but, and this is really notorious, it still, there is a broader transformation of late medieval ships on the basis of different other factors, namely, again, the further development, for example, Atlantic warfare, through the expansion of certain specific routes, the fact that more compact sort of post-universal regional states are concentrating resources to have also more reliable ships availability. There are bigger ships in that sense, that there are greater, for example, there is greater international trade flows. that makes ships bigger, and that actually is pretty good to absorb recoil just out of inertia and just the sheer mass of the ship. So the ships would have not been intentionally adapted to guns per se, but definitely for different reasons, certain ships that were bigger were better fitting for such amount of firepower. They would have been more resistant to the enemy firepower at the same time. So there is all a set of preconditions that are compounded in order to have that better type of ship, which is basically the embryonal phase of how eventually warships designed to properly integrate in their structure artillery and all what that entails would come to being. And as we were saying before, we said, I don't know, cell phones spread in a few decades. Well, if you look between Louis and this example of Jean de Vienne, it's just like 37 years or so. So it's, again, not a radical change, but still one that makes you think regarding how, especially some commanders of the time that, as you understand, were expert at different things. And there were great, admirals could be also field commanders of some sort, but general men-at-arms were trained a bit in everything, would be able to see what would happen when we would concentrate more firepower. Now, by the 15th century, most large ships were similarly equipped, so again, after another generation, basically, which is indicative of a doctrinal shift towards artillery, if not centric naval warfare, but at least one where probably the combined psychological terror and physical destruction wrought by cannon fire could substantially shape the course of maritime combat. Because boarding would still be a thing, right? And again, Atlantic warships, as you know, would develop towards sort of different functions compared to galley warfare. I made multiple videos about this, but about galley warfare, about galleons. But they could be used in the same ways. And in a sense, artillery bridged a bit this gap. Actually, eventually galleons would allow for, as you know, in the early modern age, for this ever larger amount of firepower, because you would simply stuff them with different decks and bigger hulls, like with guns, right? And the various size firing at once could really disrupt even most of what later on, like galley warfare, could compensate for. But there were also think about the galleazze. Think about, again, even how different fellows with different models of ships remain comparably competitive, right? Like probably different types of warfare were to an extent on land before sort of the broader Western way took over. Also in those parts of the same West that had sort of differed a little bit. And this is, I would say, more accentuated in naval warfare than in field armies, right? Again, for example, the Atlantic and Mediterranean philosophies, we can so call them, are sort of much more different, whereas on land, the respective countries were basically fighting in the same ways, right? Differently from, for example, like other parts of Eastern Europe that had remained sort of more, either more archaic, or, for example, they simply didn't have the means to develop the pike and shot types of warfare, right? But even later, for example, at the time of Peter the Great, it would have still galleys being functional against the Swedish Navy. We're talking the early 18th century. In the shallow waters of the eastern Swedish coastline. And the Swedes had been the first who had developed that kind of they fit the Atlantic tradition, but they were the ones who had actually integrated artillery first in fully fledged, in fact, an ad hoc design warship design. So it's structure. So it's really right. It really tells you how military-wise there are sort of different things you can do at the same time with different means, sometimes obtaining even greater results. There isn't such a thing like this is the absolute best. It depends on the context and how you use that. That always decides the thing. And warfare is basically about this, putting the enemy in a condition of inferiority that he does not basically envisage, and very often on the basis of this presumed symmetry that actually does not exist, because warfare is always asymmetrical by definition. We know that Spanish ships, if you're interested, I made also a video about the Castilian fleets of the 13th, 14th century, had also embraced guns by no later than 1359. Again, this is at least what we can document. They had this likely since the beginning of the story, motivated, of course, from their side, but their immersion in Mediterranean naval innovations and the urgent need to counter the ambitions of the various rivals. The Aragonese naturally were much more sort of Mediterranean-oriented. The Castilians had begun, also with the help of the Genoese allies in an anti-Aragonese function, to open, as we've seen, the Atlantic route to make of Seville a great port. And remember, the Genoese were the ones providing with navies to St. France and England in that early phase of the 100 Years' War and before, to the French during that early phase of the 100 Years' War and before, right? So again, the Italian technology from the Christian side was the most advanced at sea, although it was advanced by edge, right? The bulk of this technology was basically the same everywhere. It's also about whom uses it. Again, crews, admirals, ships themselves. Again, that's what makes actually the quality of these of this maritime republic's service. In any case, when you look especially at regional powers like Aragon, Castile, you realize that the contest for regional supremacy did also pass through this more doctrinally emerging sense of technological investment, right? The idea of having in the moment like some core of royally owned ships that are also properly fit for example, deploying greater firepower, is something that can deliver the core of these forces with more punch, with more projectional force, more strategic, if not range, but effectiveness in general, also on the map, so to say. If you have to force, as we'll see now, the entrance to an harbor, right? Having this guns will not be the decisive factor, but it will help, right? It's something that, again, gradually develops, spurring in turn, like the rapid technological diffusion, for example, in this case, across the Iberian fleets. And it's not like the Iberian Peninsula was particularly super technologically advanced, right? It was okay. But, for example, England and France were more ahead. The Italians were more ahead. We've seen this in other videos. Doesn't matter. Well, the fact that there were some crowns here that could invest into such gunned ships is really the measure by which like a conventional strategic relevance made by this technology will actually manifest itself. Now, passing to the Italians, that are obviously the actually more documented and sort of, in this sense, in proportion to the pop cultural attention that is given to them, the most underrated. So we said it before, Venice is a bit like the gold standard of any naval thing in medieval Europe. I made multiple videos about the Venetian Navy and army organization as well. We often forget the Venetians had a hell of an army, of a land army as well. And amphibious operations are, in this sense, requiring, but not even just like land operation, terrestrial warfare. That's why before I mentioned, the Molinella or Caravaggio, we are there in the 15th century. But since the beginning, like the Venetian army would have been provided with guns. Again, there is no evidence whatsoever. For example, Jan Heath says that, the first, the Venetians began arming their ships with cannons in 1379. during the onset of the War of Chioggia. It would be the fourth Venetian-Genoese War. By the way, I made a video about the third Venetian-Genoese War between 1350-55, if you're interested in the context. And we'll expand on the War of Chioggia. It is the more relevant. That's where Venice could have been knocked out by Genoa. So it doesn't make any sense. Like the fact that at some point, I don't know, you used sources like maybe not even mallet at the time for heat, but that simply say, oh, notionalistically, in 1379 we have this document that everybody cites from whoever gets historiographical references from the current Italian warfare studies, is the point where Venetians started using cannons on ships. Really Venetians had that way before. At this point it's being also more extensively documented. Again, how does documentation regarding terrestrial versus naval warfare fare in this sense? Well, of course, naval warfare was much less prominent than terrestrial one, right? We covered this also in other videos. We haven't made, I think, any more general naval warfare content than something up to the 13th century for the general sort of ancient and medieval naval warfare basic sort of introductions. But obviously enough, still at this point, naval warfare is mostly just like about coastal navigation and support of land armies. Fundamentally, it's the necessity of having a guard over your cargoes, and so especially as far as an army is involved, to protect the supply lines of the same. It's admittedly getting more dynamic towards the later Middle Ages, aside from the Atlantic routes and some greater geographical projection of armies, their of fleets, their general sort of more scientific, as we've seen, more doctrinal employment. Still, that's the level of subordination. It is much more and really relentless terrestrial warfare than there is naval warfare, except naval warfare, in a sense, it depends on how you consider it, because by cost, it would have been actually equivalent, right? If you look at, like in this case, for example, the Venetian-Genoese wars, these powers poured into that like levels of wealth that likely really entail like contained the military expenses of most Central Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, in more numerical terms, of course, ships were less. Like generally speaking, fleets also embarked troops for possible landings. Other expeditions were naturally less frequently used. So in general, when it gets down to documentation, of course, we have much greater availability of the terrestrial use of artillery in the sources than at sea, right? So the fact that, for example, like all these powers would have had the first mention of guns historically sort of delayed by a few decades, may be random, maybe if you actually study, because it also depends on the context, but generally speaking, whenever you had a fleet, you had some sort of more thriving, literate, economical, sort of mercantile reality that is easier to document, as opposed to feudal continental forces. We're talking about that, for example, for Lithuania. That definitely is not a place about which we know very much, but that turns out to have used artillery as well. So nothing so directly proportionate in that way. But again, definitely land warfare is much better documented. Just different countries are better documented. So from one another, and so this is also an important discriminant. Again, it doesn't make much sense to try to say, okay, this was the first, this was not the first. It's mostly like the size of guns that you could, in this sense, embark that really mattered. the War of Chioggia was particularly important as far as not just amphibious warfare, but in this sense, amphibious use of artillery was concerned, like mastering the complex terrain of coastal lagoons and confined waterways, where traditional naval tactics were often constrained by environmental factors. Specifically, what was going on, as you know, with the War of Chioggia is that the Genoese had landed. They had managed to crush the Venetian fleet, and at that point, they were the only power provided with the means to destroy Venice because of their fleet. Right, it was mostly the problem. If you weren't like another of these maritime republics, you couldn't quite have the naval means to knock out the other, which were the only ones who could knock out the other. And in especially Venice, telling the truth, because Genoa at least was more permeable from land. Venice was that point, and the Genoese had managed to outclass the Venetians. A couple of battles, they landed in Chioggia, and they basically wanted to take the city. So the Venetians basically creep in with their own fortifications close to the Genoese ones. They launch at the solstice of winter during the night, like at least with more preparing for the battle at dawn, with the most extensive cover of darkness, to come close to the enemy fortifications, basically taking them out. Right, and cornering them basically. And a lot of this warfare in the lagoons, this pretty difficult terrain, witnesses the use of artillery, both in fact on land and at sea. Right, and so we'll talk about that campaign, those battles. And again, the Venetians already had that artillery in order to do this. The Genoese as well, they both used it on ships already from quite a while, to say the least, and they were, in fact, the most expert at this point in the sea. In fact, these Italians mounted guns in the forecastles of their galleys and on smaller longboats designed for shallow water operations, in this case, exploiting the agility of these vessels to deliver precise, high-impact artillery strikes against enemy fortifications and fleets. A strategy that anticipated the development of specialized gunboats in later centuries as well. Genoese galleys, again, were pretty well armed in this context. They lost, if anything, the war for other reasons. And the Italians in particular were driven by their mutual, fierce competition for the control of the Mediterranean, the vital trade routes demanding both cutting-edge technology advancements and tactical superiority to outmaneuver rival maritime powers. There is no step that they take out then in tandem, and they are quite successfully developing naval artillery exactly as a consequence of this nearly lethal warfare that they're massively investing in, financially wise and beyond. And all this considering they are operating all over the Mediterranean, they're the gold standard. Right, at this point there are also the Catalans that have their own say, but the Italians in as a whole are by far sort of the gold standard in naval engineering, artillery development, and especially at this point military spending for that same technologies. Again, we could expand on the Mamluks, and at some point I will surely make a video on what was going on in Egypt and why was this country so updated in naval technology as opposed to, for example, the Turks in Anatolia that at this point were still sort of just scattered pirates, right? Egypt was, again, that's the same point we made before, was great power with a pretty solid stability, good also trade balance, at least throughout the 14th century, which means they had the sort of the resources, the technicians. They had enough connection also with Italian traffic, especially with Venice historically. Politically and institutionally, they were quite similar for an Islamic power to the same Westerners, right? They had sort of a more urbanized and more civilized and sort of millenary continuative tradition in that sense compared to, say, I don't know, Mesopotamia at that point. It was very much influenced by, feudal Persia and the Mongols that ruled over them, like with lots of sort of civilizational destructuring all around. The Chronicle of Froissart, if you don't know who he is, shame. But don't worry, Schwerpunkt made a video about him. This was the greatest medieval French chronicler. He was actually Flemish, but, the Flanders, he lived actually he was from exactly the border with the Holy Roman Imperial land. But he was a Flemish himself, but he ended up writing this most famous chronicles in French. He had an extraordinary life in many ways. A great example, this third estater at the service of different feudal courts, France and England at the same time during the same 100 Years' War. So he's, as you know, the big source of the sort of early to mid 100 Years' War history. And really an extraordinary figure. And he describes the Genoese fleet's approach to Mahdia in 1390. So we are in Tunisia. This is a Barbary pirate nest, and Froissart documents this also because of the old Franco-Genoese partnership. During the 100 Years' War, we were saying it just before, the Genoese provided France with basically everything as far as ships were concerned, also the famous Genoese crossbowmen on land, etc. So there was this historical partnership. There's this expedition to destroy this port, and Froissart, by documenting the event against the Islamic foes, said, quote, they sent in, speaking of the Genoese tactics here, they sent in first their light vessels, called brigandines, well furnished with artillery. They entered into the haven, and after them came the armed galleys and the other ships of the fleet in good order. Right. This passage is beautiful because it reveals this sophisticated operational strategy using speed and maneuverability with brigandines to conduct the preliminary bombardment, then weakening defenses and creating openings for the main fleet's coordinated assault. This is a tactic that prefigured modern naval doctrines of fire support and phase engagements. It's very interesting because you would expect that, as we also made the case, because it was the case for, of course, the biggest ships, the flag ones, to have more firepower. But having these path openers with the brigandines were smaller vessels, however, provided with artillery. So they were in part balancing that thing out. As we've seen here, we're in 1390, the example of 1377 for the French witness, like the bulking of ships. So brigandines were chosen here because we're smaller, more agile, but at the same time we're provided with enough guns to sort of breach, like to open basically, to pave the way through the bigger ships, to the galleys that were also more loaded with marines and so on, to eventually storm this place, but probably to break initially the enemy defenses. It's interesting also because it's not like these guns were simply, I don't know, tearing down into dust the port's walls or whatever. But in terms of fire suppression, of general shock, of fire capacity, of course, at this point we can imagine crossbows being used all over. By the way, at this point, we're after the 70s, the 80s, the Italians have already, like, among their own infantry on land, like 1/3 of handgunners. So you can imagine different types of weapons used in this context to suppress the enemy fortifications and the battlements, etc. And so eventually bringing in the fleet, the bulkier fleet, that would have been, for example, slower than the brigandines, that even when loaded with artillery would have been sort of more agile to maneuver, so they could come closer, which was risky because, of course, like the Tunisians here would have had guns of their own. but they even had, we've documented it recently also, Christian mercenaries at their service. Not quite here, likely, so to make even a difference, normally was in their courts somewhere else. But the game is obvious, like you suppress the enemy and then you overwhelm them with this greater quantity of troops that can approach also more safely as far as the enemy defenses are suppressed, right? Naturally, here we do not have the actual strength ratios involved. Of course, maybe was a fairly relevant center here along the North African coast, but it's not like every town on the coast was properly equipped just to withstand any sort of raid. Right? This is very important. It's not really before the Victorian era that naval warfare will gain that capacity to simply blockade stretches of land to secure an entire stretches of sea and intercepting everybody. There could always be like the same Barbary pirates did, like a target somewhere. These are some, I think, the same close years of when the Barbary pirates raided up to Iceland, right? So it's actually a pretty brutal moment. And again, you can always with greater force in general, with greater concentration of force to raid, to defend these places for whichever political purpose that also was at stake here, as we've seen in recent videos. Of course, the North African economy was largely revolving around the northern shores, on one of the northern shores of the Mediterranean. So there was always a good, at least there was always a reason out there, given the political fragmentation and instability of Middle Ages, especially from this side of North African Islamic powers, to sort of, go shoot someone with guns, right? Just to have fun. Let's be honest about that. But it's remarkable how Froissart, for example, documents this tactics. This tells you also how knowledgeable Europeans were at large about. I mean, Froissart would have surely known some Genoese, and along the way there was also plenty of them in the Flemish ports, etc. I made different videos also about the Hanseatic League, how this tied with Mediterranean traffics as well. But how this makes sense. By the way, Froissart, and we'll describe this in the aforementioned video about him, sometimes he's a bit, licentious, poetically wise. Like, he writes for courts, so he has to entertain with not with fantasy, but with like the big chivalric ideal. And so even this kind of battles would have been a bit like with special effects or something. But here, of course, he's also quite objective in many ways. What he describes makes a lot of sense. Lighter ships can go back and forth and shoot with this more pernicious, precise way for the times, and then the bulkier ships that once the enemy is suppressed during this ballet, after this ballet, can approach. After all, if you look at land warfare during these years, you see that in Europe, for example, there are lots of mounted crossbowmen, right, and that they will keep developing throughout the later Middle Ages. Why? Because the men-at-arms are always bulkier, and so more specialized cavalry, and like in the past, there had always been mounted crossbowmen, even archers. I even made a video about the 13th century mounted crossbowmen. But at this point, they were more functional to pave the way to the heavier, bulkier forces. And this is what essentially the Genoese are doing in this scenery, right? They simply pave the way for the bigger forces to engage and to overwhelm enemy resistance. Throughout this period, it was also standard to mount a single powerful gun at the prow of galleys. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You basically just point the ship where you want to go, and so you have that amount of precision of fire concentration. Just the same bullet has the same ship's speed to a degree, and just this gun can be better properly stiffened, right, connected with the vessel. It sort of it can be well balanced, in a symmetrical fashion with the ship's barycentrum, so everything adds up. It's really a configuration optimized also for example, increasing the effectiveness of ramming tactics in frontal assault that were still, again, the thing. Normally ramming occurred still in different ways, and from classical antiquity, but still in the Middle Ages in useful ways. Mostly it was properly the front of the ship above water that caused at some point disruption. But you also, how troops, for example, disembark, right, by simply smashing into the enemy ships and then pouring on it from the same prow of their own ship. And having a gun there, like, could essentially add to that punch, right? It's this heavy projectile could also splinter enemy hulls, disable or systems, or wreak havoc on deck crews, thereby tilting the balance in close quarter combat, hopefully, if, of course, the wall operations were correctly carried out. Again, as we said before, it's not like ramming, like boarding tactics, that never really changed in principle from a quite a long time, especially boarding. And so you would need these guns at the same level of the enemy, so the battlements of the same ships, to also wipe the enemy decks of anybody who was trying to protect them from the side, from in fact such position. Smaller guns were later positioned around the forecastle and stern castles. We are in the 15th century. This naturally allowed to shoot people from above, and these structures were lighter than the, say, less resistant in general themselves. They were more exposed to guns themselves, so it didn't make too much sense even just to lodge like a bigger gun there. Sometimes you couldn't even have the space to properly operate it. And it was easier there to install smaller guns that, as we've seen, could be easily mounted, dismounted, according to circumstances, but were really painful, and especially if these were some sort of sharpshooters for this, the time being, that they could really offend quite thoroughly, especially, again, the Marines on the enemy decks. Enhancing the galleys' versatility, also in broadside engagement, and fortifying its defenses against boarding actions. It's a critical adaptation in an era where naval battles frequently, as we've seen, culminated into hand-to-hand combat. Naturally, when you look at how naval engineering develops, it develops in tandem. It's not like one people had this specific design. Of course, again, the Westerners had the best galleys here in this sense. They had also the best evolving sort of towards galleon shapes, with the cogs, the carracks, etc. And those, for example, had that kind of elevation tendentially. For example, this was noticed in different situations. It's not the first time. That think about Caesar against the Veneti, that had sort of taller ships to better withstand the Atlantic waves and so on. But that's not also just a discriminant, right? You need different tactics, like that same example proves to be really capable, to be updated. The largest galleys, powered by 4 oars per bench, were further equipped with substantial guns along the hull's flanks. This really increased their firepower a lot, even, again, where the space on the galley was not this enormous thing, because you had all the oars and the oarsmen. But there were different ways of fitting that, and it would have been really interesting to see how this varies, because some of these guns were fixed, but as we were saying before, some of them were also just dismountable, and it would have been dismounted depending on where, for example, the enemy would have, I don't know, if it's some kind of strange situation, the enemy had, as we've seen before, like rammed you, and they would have started pouring on your deck from one side. Well, if you could, for example, wheel about your gun, so simply dismounting them and starting to shoot from the same deck against those guys, well, everything would have been quite useful. Probably this versatility was, considering everything ended up in boarding most of the times, this was particularly relevant, right? And of course, artillery firepower began to exact greater tolls, especially towards the end of the period, than any other artillery had done prior at that distance. So that warfare began to change towards really new, almost unforeseen directions. However, there was still the sense that naval combat was very much a hand-to-hand fight. Think about the Battle of Lepanto. Remember those deadlocks, right, of ships simply forming these enormous bridges were all aligned, like the troops were to dismount from and starting to fight against each other. Like it's really an incredibly brutal, physical, close-range encounter. And so guns, unsurprisingly, towards the Renaissance, developed with these turrets properly designed to sweep the enemy decks with mitraille. And that's kind of the most obvious thing. You have these effective guns that can shoot against concentrated troops in these confined spaces of the decks. It's just like what happens in open field, like when of course there is much greater space and artillery is vulnerable to outflanking. But if anyone is so foolish to charge it frontally, you will just get normally like the self-defensive artillery in that case is mitraille. And it's not like artillery always survives in that sense either, because to a certain point, like artillery is not this anti-personnel thing that we can imagine. For a long time, cavalry charges would at most be annoyed by artillery. However, with increasing losses, so the largest galleys were also designed to maximize firepower. Obviously enough, they had more space for guns. Naturally, everything was also was all about maintaining satisfactory hydrodynamic efficiency. This fostered further advanced shipbuilding techniques that balanced the structural demands of heavy artillery with the imperatives of speed and stability in Mediterranean waters. Galleys designs, as you know, will not really change that much, but there is, aside from the most straightforward appearance, a lot of technological developments occurring that reinforce the galley to deliver that kind of greater firepower performance. Evidently, maneuvering in the Mediterranean with those particular conditions, currents, etc., was more important. Otherwise, they would have changed. Had artillery been as important as the ship design, the naval engineering to core, they would have changed ships. And this is something that would not happen until the 17th century. I made a video about the Venetian galley, say the Armata Grossa and Sottile that started differentiating that. But again, that's also, in fact, the end of the Mediterranean as, for example, Italy to be a superpower, and with Venice with that greater naval force that it had been before. And in fact, those other Atlantic ships models from, the English, the Dutch, especially at that point, were taking over like the entire Western naval philosophy, doctrine, and art of war. And so these other powers did adapt in that way. But still, for example, the Barbary pirates kept using smaller powers, those galleys. And again, this is interesting, but it shows that fundamentally, even if you look at those galleons, for example, they don't really. It's not about the single gun. It's still about the structure of the ship that can host so many, right? So that's why, for example, the galley doesn't change really much in appearance, aside from, for example, the size, because at the end of the day, the way you maneuver these ships is more important than their firepower. And this is valid for every ship there. So it's really, really important to stress, and we'll come back on the topic also in other videos. So the evolution, especially in this development, also stepping up, right, in galley armament during the late Middle Ages, which was consistently palpable at some point, not only amplified the galley offensive capabilities, but also fundamentally reshaped Mediterranean naval punching capacity, so that also strategically speaking, warfare became sort of a more concentrated business, where, as we've seen, as more guns were more available, also more ships were available, and bigger ones were available. And so these bigger models and a greater punch that could use at some point, again, in the great struggles between the Christians and the Ottomans and beyond. So it's really complicated. In all this, of course, growing reliance on artillery duels is fostered. This could preempt or supersede traditional tactics of ramming and boarding in certain circumstances, but at large remaining otherwise unchanged. But laying also in the groundwork also in this circumstance for the advancement in gun, the increasing importance of naval artillery towards the Renaissance, when technological and tactical innovations would really change a big deal of maritime power projection, especially. These aspects, of course, are not random. We appreciate the sort of greater capacities that most powers had at the time to just keep up with this after for the times rapid development, and again reflect on the fact that they were sort of just obliged to do so given the obvious contextual pressure that they would get in order to be ever more updated. And as we've seen also in other videos, for example, the ones about the Armada, that is not that far away at this point, how, let's say, demean, again, it's not a technology per se, but what you can do with sort of more advanced stages of development. And when some people say, okay, let's invest in this because we can get more through that in a broader strategic sense, this is especially the case at sea, because as we explained, fleets are smaller than armies, right? And so, but you still can do an enormous deal with that, and with the enemy supply routes, with the general like damage you can inflict to a specific theater, market, or whatever. And the sense of all this, of course, is that the more you invest in that technology at sea, that the more it's going to work compared to land armies. It may seem strange because also, again, land armies have their own changes, but it's something, in fact, less refined. Like at sea, everything is more technical, and you have to rely more on that specific dynamic in order to be effective and obtain so much. Just like a specific technological investment in this regard would never be seen like that. It was mostly about the amount of ships you could levy, etc. But still, will yield greater results on even, again, pretty wide scenarios. And this is especially evident, again, when the oceanic routes are open, right? And again, if you are interested, you can check that series on the Armada that, by the way, I'm going to update hopefully soon, because it's also such an important topic altogether to explain how balanced the odds are in war, even when there are some important systemic differences in this regard. So again, the technology is fairly similar, but the way you decline it, the way you really invest in it is something else. It's much bigger, and that's the space where, as we said before, in terms of asymmetry, the enemy is going to find you, let's say, and find your vulnerability and exploiting them, and you can do the same with him. So it's all mutual, as long as, of course, like you remain relevant, you remain updated, you are capable of competing, and in fact having the chance to prevail. And so when you look at late medieval naval warfare, you realize how gradual the introduction of artillery was and how sort of limited in scope it looked. Because again, it's really, especially compared to siege warfare on land, it's also more difficult to see how relevant artillery is at this point in the picture, because we're not yet, especially in the time where warships were properly designed for artillery, say integration. But that's also because we tend to underestimate a bit the versatility and the general role of artillery in general, not just gunpowder, but how effective artillery was used in the Middle Ages, right? Had we seen this at another level in, I don't know, of siege war, for example, something that can't compare, everything would be sort of clear. One series that I really like is one about medieval naval warfare. I'm aware, of course, that I've already done something, but I've mostly started the stuff from ancient history, and so arriving up to, I don't know, Byzantine, Viking era, but we haven't talked so much about medieval naval warfare. I know that probably videos like this will be less watched, but I must make them because I think that completion is a form of long-term investment on the channel. When I see, I surely even have a playlist, Medieval Naval Warfare 11 videos. This is going to be the 12th. Well, it's not so bad, actually, right? We have more than I thought, but if we were to, there is also relatively less information. I will have to sort something out here because it's not immediately obvious how and why we should talk about this. I should also start making some videos about amphibious, some playlists about amphibious warfare, because it happened to find something like that. We made more medieval naval warfare than modern naval warfare videos, which is somehow interesting. But I'm always glad that we managed to cover so much. After all, I hope that really this kind of videos are going to help anyone. Then I don't know how much the stuff gets watched, because it seems to me that, not too few after all, But in the moment, it always feels like, not enough views, and that's a shame. I think a majority of videos I make, of course, revolve around the Middle Ages, and in proportion, the medieval naval warfare aspect is pretty much reduced, it's pretty much small, right? So I will try to make this more. But, we have so much stuff incoming. Sometimes I say, oh my God, this video is, nobody's going to watch it, whatever. And I really already know this. I already know what kind of stuff you watch more or less, and I quite carefully follow some sort of strategy for keeping the views regular, steady, let's say, not to have excessive ups and downs. But no, seriously, there is much. But please consider also any other kind of video. For example, that video I made yesterday about the Crimean War, right? The first one made lots of views. The second one, at least from the start, is not making too much. I don't understand why or how. But, for example, in that case, we have to stiffen 19th century warfare. Imagine the point we arrived to having, several tens of videos on that. It's going to be not complete, of course, but still something that can attract more and more people and blend, because this is really my objective at the end of the day, bringing people who like specific military history phases and topics to appreciate the other eras, right? And I think that the fact that I'm the single person here talking about them all, and so basically being the only source that tells you at the same time, doesn't change voice or standards or evaluation on the basis of the historical topic. I'm just blending everything all together, as you know, also with my traditional insight and sort of moral idea and Clausewitzian theory behind my entire historical philosophy, so to say. I think it's really such a unique opportunity to appreciate, in fact, even these less known topics. I really must start something about, but I can't properly. It's difficult to put together simply in a structured way, but I'm really trying, and I'm sure I'm going to come up with that. A Royal Navy series, like especially 18th, 19th century Royal Navy, British Royal Navy. This is really such an important step we must take, and we must actually talk a bit more about British warfare in general. We have to expand in the same centuries, like in the same 18th, 19th centuries, in order to have an adequate coverage of that. Again, it's difficult. You go step by step. I take my time to sort of, write enough here, and I try, of course, to stay relevant and to stay on topic, because, again, I think that overall we're doing fairly well in terms of topics distribution, but I don't know, I'm habituated to this rhythm, and I think it's going to go well. Again, I sometimes tell you we get too few views, etc., but the bulkiness of the channel now is felt in the analytics. There is something about it that it's as if it never slept, right? It was always connected with this continuous rate of views that unavoidably pertain to a broader awareness of tens of thousands of people of the fact that I'm here, I'm making this kind of content, etc. And so I personally think that we're going towards the right direction in general, and I'm fairly confident that there is enough room for further content that really will blend this all together. Perhaps I'm going to slightly reduce the specials, I think, because one thing I realized is that I thought the specials would make more views simply, right? And sometimes it is true. But I realized that most of you here are for the Middle Ages, because, of course, I mostly made medieval history stuff. There is also a lot of ancient history stuff that I prepare as well, and so on. And again, that's good, but let's not forget about the rest of history, because that's definitely what I don't do, even when I just talk about Middle Ages. And again, history is really tough. There is really a lot to do, lots of videos to prepare. Everything is really difficult. It's really much more difficult than it seems. Nevertheless, I am confident that we're really doing well after all, and we don't have to fear. Plenty of mostly medieval warfare, don't worry, there is plenty of that. And let's concentrate this. Let's concentrate at all levels. Let's be fair about the whole picture. And let's simply be also more curious, more active, etc., because that really helps the whole. And I'm really looking forward to do everything, to cover every single topic and to look at it together with you. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.